The night Deborah Carter's fingers touched those ivory keys, she had no idea she was about to shatter every assumption in that room, including her own. What started as cruel humiliation would become the moment that changed everything. But first, she had to survive the worst night of her life. Welcome to tonight's story, where pride meets talent and assumptions crumble like glass. Stay with me until the very end to see how this unfolds. And don't forget to comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany floors of La Fontaine Raleigh's most prestigious restaurant, where a single meal cost more than most people made in a week. The soft murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle clink of expensive silverware against fine china, creating a symphony of affluence that Deborah Carter had grown accustomed to hearing but never participating in. She moved between the tables like a ghost, her black uniform pristine, her smile practiced, but never quite reaching her eyes. 26 years old with calloused fingertips, hidden beneath white gloves, and dreams buried deeper than the restaurant's wine cellar, Deborah had perfected the art of invisibility. In a place where she served people who spent more on appetizers than she made in tips all week, being invisible was survival. "Excuse me, miss." The voice cut through her thoughts like ice. Deborah turned to find Mrs. Wellington, a regular customer, whose pearl necklace probably cost more than Deborah's yearly rent, holding up an empty wine glass with the sort of imperious gesture that expected immediate attention. "Of course, Mrs. Wellington. The usual Chateau Margaux." Deborah's voice was steady, professional, betraying nothing of the exhaustion that had settled into her bones after pulling double shifts for the past month. "Make it quick, dear. We're expecting important company tonight." Mrs. Wellington's eyes never met Deborah's, as if acknowledging her humanity might somehow diminish the woman's own status. As Deborah hurried toward the wine cellar, she caught her reflection in one of the gilded mirrors that lined the restaurant's walls. The face looking back at her seemed foreign. Sometimes tired eyes that had once sparkled with ambition. Hands that ached to create music, but instead carried endless plates and glasses. She paused for just a moment, remembering the last time those hands had touched piano keys. 3 days ago, in the early morning hours before her shift, she'd snuck into the restaurant's main dining room and played on the grand Steinway that sat there like a beautiful, untouchable monument to a world she could only serve, never inhabit. The memory was interrupted by the sound of expensive shoes on marble. Deborah quickly composed herself and returned to the dining room, where the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Conversations had grown quieter, more deferential, and several guests were craning their necks toward the entrance. Leonard Grayson had arrived. Even if Deborah hadn't recognized the man from the business magazines that littered the restaurant's waiting area, his presence would have been unmistakable. He moved through the room like he owned it, which, according to the whispered rumors among the staff, he very well might. Real estate mogul, political influencer, and social media personality, with millions of followers who hung on his every pronouncement about success, wealth, and what he called knowing your place in the world. He was younger than Deborah had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of cultivated appearance that spoke of personal trainers, expensive haircuts, and skincare routines that cost more than most people's cars. His navy suit was tailored to perfection. His watch caught the light with every gesture, and his smile had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to weaponize charm. "Leonard, so wonderful to see you again." Mrs. Wellington practically purred as she rose from her table, her earlier imperious demeanor melting into something approaching reverence. "Margaret, darling." Leonard's voice carried across the room with the sort of projection that suggested he was accustomed to being heard and to being listened to. "I hope you don't mind. I've brought a few friends tonight. Business, you know how it is." Behind him trailed an entourage of equally well-dressed individuals, their expressions ranging from calculated interest to barely concealed boredom. They moved as a pack predators, comfortable in their territory, secure in their assumption that everything and everyone around them existed for their entertainment. Deborah watched from her position near the service station as the maitre d' Francois nearly tripped over himself in his eagerness to accommodate the unexpected party. Within minutes, they had been seated at the restaurant's most prestigious table, the one positioned perfectly to observe the entire dining room while commanding its attention. "You there!" Leonard's voice cut across the ambient noise of the restaurant like a blade. Deborah looked up to find his attention fixed squarely on her. "Yes, you. Come here." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they became more subdued, more watchful. This was the sort of moment that would be dissected over coffee and gossip for weeks afterward, the moment when Leonard Grayson, master of the universe, decided to focus his attention on someone. Deborah approached the table with measured steps, her training kicking in automatically. Smile, maintain eye contact, appear eager to please without seeming desperate. The fundamentals of service industry survival. "Good evening, Mr. Grayson. Welcome back to La Fontaine. Can I start you with our wine selection tonight?" Leonard leaned back in his chair, studying her with the sort of frank appraisal usually reserved for livestock at auction. His companions watched with varying degrees of amusement, clearly anticipating entertainment. "What's your name?" he asked, ignoring her question entirely. "Deborah, sir. Deborah Carter." "Deborah." He rolled the name around his mouth like he was tasting wine. "How long have you been working here, Deborah?" 3 years, sir." 3 years. Leonard nodded thoughtfully, then turned to his companions. "Did you hear that? 3 years? And tell me, Deborah, what do you do when you're not serving tables?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Deborah felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant pressing down on her. This wasn't about ordering dinner anymore. This was about something else entirely. Something that made her skin crawl even as she maintained her professional smile. I enjoy music, sir, but primarily I focus on my work here." "Music?" Leonard's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. "How delightful! What kind of music?" "Piano, sir." "Piano." Leonard's smile grew wider, and Deborah felt her stomach clench with sudden dread. "How absolutely fascinating. You know, we have a piano right here in the restaurant. That beautiful Steinway over there." He gestured toward the corner where the grand piano sat in elegant silence, its black surface reflecting the chandelier light like still water. "Yes, sir. It's quite beautiful." "I bet it is. Tell me, Deborah, can you actually play? Or is that just something you tell people at parties?" The question was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took Deborah a moment to process it fully. Around the table, Leonard's companions exchanged glances that ranged from uncomfortable to anticipatory. This was what they had come for, not the food, not the ambiance, but the show. "I can play, sir." "Really?" Leonard's voice dripped with skepticism. "Because you know, a lot of people say they can do things. They have these little fantasies about themselves, these dreams that help them get through their ordinary little lives. But when push comes to shove, when the moment arrives to actually prove themselves..." He shrugged eloquently. "Well, let's just say reality has a way of being disappointing." Deborah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I understand, sir. Would you like to see our wine menu?" "Oh, don't change the subject. We're having such an interesting conversation." Leonard leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "You see, I'm fascinated by people like you. People who serve others, who spend their lives making other people comfortable, making sure other people's needs are met. It's such a noble calling." The word noble dripped with condescension so thick it was almost visible. "I find it interesting," Leonard continued, "how people in service positions often have these little hobbies, these little talents they like to think make them special. As if playing piano in your spare time somehow elevates you above your station." He gestured around the elegant dining room. "But the truth is, there's a reason some people serve and others are served. There's a natural order to things." The restaurant had grown so quiet that Deborah could hear the soft tick of the antique clock on the far wall. She was acutely aware of every eye on her, of the weight of expectation and judgment pressing down like a physical force. "Now," Leonard said, settling back in his chair like a king on his throne, "I'm going to make you an offer, Deborah. I want you to go over to that piano and play something for us. Something that will demonstrate this talent you claim to have. Sir, I don't think... Oh, but I insist. Leonard's smile never wavered, but his voice carried an edge of steel. Consider it part of the evening's entertainment. After all, we're paying customers, and customer satisfaction is your job, isn't it? Deborah felt the trap closing around her. To refuse would mean humiliation, probably termination, and definitely the loss of the job she desperately needed. But to agree meant exposing herself, revealing the part of her soul she had kept hidden and protected for so long. I'm working, sir. I don't think the management would... Francois... Leonard called out, his voice carrying easily across the restaurant. The maitre d' hurried over with the eager attention of a man whose livelihood depended on keeping his most influential customers happy. Yes, Mr. Grayson. How can I assist you? I was just telling Deborah here that I'd love to hear her play your magnificent piano. She tells me she's quite talented. You wouldn't object to a little musical entertainment for your guests, would you? Francois glanced between Leonard and Deborah, clearly calculating the politics of the situation. Leonard Grayson's displeasure could make or break a restaurant like La Fontaine. Deborah Carter was a waitress who could be replaced before the dinner rush ended. Of course, Mr. Grayson. If Deborah is comfortable with it, we would be delighted to have some musical accompaniment to the evening. Leonard's smile was triumphant. Wonderful. You see, Deborah. Everyone agrees it's a marvelous idea. Deborah looked around the restaurant, seeing faces that ranged from curious to pitying to entertained. These people had come for dinner and found themselves witnesses to a public execution. Some looked uncomfortable with Leonard's obvious manipulation, but none seemed inclined to intervene. What would you like me to play? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise. Oh, anything you like. Leonard waved his hand dismissively. Something that showcases your talent. Something that justifies all those years of practice I'm sure you've put in. Deborah nodded slowly, feeling like she was moving underwater. Each step toward the piano felt both inevitable and surreal, as if she were watching someone else walk toward their own destruction. The Steinway sat in the corner like a beautiful sleeping giant. Deborah had touched these keys before, but never like this. Never with an audience, never with so much riding on every note. She pulled out the bench and sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the keyboard. The silence in the restaurant was absolute now. Conversations had died, completely replaced by the sort of breathless anticipation that preceded either triumph or catastrophe. Deborah could feel Leonard's eyes on her, could sense his smug satisfaction at having maneuvered her into this position. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, trying to find the music that lived in her heart, despite everything that had tried to kill it. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Music isn't about proving anything to anyone, baby girl. It's about telling the truth. Her fingers found the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated into the expectant silence. The melody was simple at first, almost hesitant, like a question being asked in the darkness. But as Deborah's confidence grew, as she forgot about the watching eyes and the cruel smile on Leonard's face, something magical began to happen. The music began to tell her story. Each note carried the weight of her struggles, the beauty of her dreams, the pain of her sacrifices. The melody soared and fell, like her own heart speaking truths that words could never capture. The restaurant faded away, Leonard's presence became irrelevant, and there was only the music, only the conversation between her soul and the keys beneath her fingers. The nocturne built to its emotional climax, the melody singing with a purity and power that seemed to transform the very air in the room. Deborah's technique was flawless, her interpretation deeply personal, her execution breathtaking. This wasn't the playing of someone who had learned piano as a hobby. This was the voice of someone who had been born to make music. As the final notes faded into silence, the restaurant remained frozen for a long moment. Then slowly, like snow beginning to fall, the applause started. It began with one person, then another, then spread throughout the room until it became a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Deborah opened her eyes to find the entire restaurant on its feet, faces that had been skeptical or indifferent, now glowing with admiration and awe. Mrs. Wellington was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Francois was beaming like a proud father. Even Leonard's companions were applauding their earlier amusement, replaced by genuine appreciation. But Leonard himself sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been embarrassment. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he had miscalculated badly. He had expected to humiliate a simple waitress and instead had created a moment of transcendent beauty that made his cruelty look petty and small by comparison. Deborah stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had played her truth for all to hear, and they had listened. They had really listened. That was... Francois approached her with tears in his eyes. "Mademoiselle, that was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." "Thank you," Deborah whispered, still not quite believing what had just happened. The applause continued, and gradually other diners began to approach, offering congratulations and praise. An elderly man pressed her hand and told her she had reminded him of his late wife, who had been a pianist. A young couple asked if she gave lessons. A woman in an expensive dress slipped her a business card and whispered something about connections in the music industry. Through it all, Leonard sat at his table in stunned silence, his carefully constructed moment of superiority crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. His companions were now talking animatedly among themselves, their attention completely diverted from him to the waitress who had just revealed herself to be something extraordinary. But even as Deborah accepted the congratulations and praise, even as she felt the warmth of recognition for the first time in years, she was acutely aware that this moment was both a triumph and a complication. She had shown them who she really was, had revealed the depth of talent she had been hiding behind her server's smile. The question now was what would happen next. Because Leonard Grayson didn't look like a man who was prepared to let this evening end with his humiliation. His face had gone through several emotions, shock, embarrassment, anger, and was now settling into something that looked suspiciously like calculation. He was already regrouping, already plotting his next move. And Deborah, still basking in the glow of her unexpected triumph, had no idea that the real battle was just beginning. The applause finally began to die down, and the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses. But something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of La Fontaine. The natural order that Leonard had been so confident about just minutes earlier had been disrupted, and everyone in the room could feel it. As Deborah made her way back toward the service station, her steps were different now, more confident, more purposeful. She had tasted recognition, had felt the power of her true voice, and there was no going back to the invisibility she had once embraced. The evening was far from over, and neither Leonard nor Deborah knew it yet, but this was only the beginning of a night that would change both of their lives forever. The silence that followed Deborah's performance hung in the air like the last note of a symphony, beautiful and haunting, but Leonard Grayson wasn't about to let it linger. As the applause finally died down and conversations began to resume, he slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and predatory. The charming smile had returned to his face, but there was something cold behind his eyes now, something that made Deborah's triumph feel suddenly fragile. "Well, well," Leonard said, his voice carrying just far enough to capture the attention of nearby tables. "That was quite unexpected." He began a slow clap, each gesture dripping with condescension. "Very impressive, Deborah. Very impressive indeed." Deborah felt her stomach clench as she recognized the tone. This wasn't admiration. This was the prelude to something else entirely. She had seen that look before in the eyes of people who couldn't bear to see others rise above their designated station. "Thank you, sir," she said carefully, instinctively, reverting to the deferential tone that had protected her for 3 years. No, don't thank me yet." Leonard moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. "You see, I'm a businessman, Deborah. I recognize talent when I see it. And what I just witnessed was definitely something." He paused, letting his words settle over the restaurant like a net. Other diners were listening now, drawn by the magnetic pull of drama unfolding before their eyes. "But here's what I'm curious about." Leonard continued, his voice growing slightly louder. "If you can play like that, if you have that kind of talent, what are you doing serving tables? I mean, surely someone with your abilities should be performing at Lincoln Center, not bringing me my wine." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Deborah felt the warmth of her earlier triumph beginning to cool as she realized where this was heading. Leonard wasn't conceding defeat. He was regrouping, finding a new angle of attack. It's complicated," she said quietly. "It's not always about talent alone." "Oh, but it is." Leonard's voice rose with false enthusiasm. "Talent always finds a way, doesn't it? The cream always rises to the top. That's what I tell my followers all the time. If you're truly exceptional, if you truly deserve success, the world will recognize it." His words carried the weight of absolute certainty, the unshakable confidence of someone who had never faced a barrier he couldn't buy his way through. "So I have to ask myself," Leonard continued, beginning to pace now like a lawyer making a closing argument, "why is someone with your apparent skill working as a waitress? What's the story there, Deborah?" The restaurant had grown quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, hungry, anticipatory. These people had just witnessed something beautiful, but now they were being offered something else. The promise of secrets revealed of someone else's pain, laid bare for their entertainment. Deborah felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with performing. When she had played the piano, she had been in control, sharing her gift on her own terms. Now Leonard was trying to turn her into a specimen, something to be dissected and examined for the amusement of others. "Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "But that's just it." Leonard snapped his fingers as if she had just proven his point. Life goes according to plan for people who make plans, for people who have the drive, the ambition, the sheer force of will to make things happen. He gestured around the elegant restaurant. "Look at everyone here tonight. Do you think we're here by accident? Do you think success just happened to us?" His companions at the table were watching now with the fascination of people observing a car accident. They could sense the cruelty in Leonard's performance, but they were also entertained by it, complicit in their silence. "I've built an empire." Leonard continued, his voice growing more passionate, more evangelistic. "I've created wealth, influenced markets, changed lives, not because I was handed anything, but because I refused to accept limitations. I refused to serve when I could lead." The word serve dripped with disdain, and Deborah felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her uniform, her station, her circumstances, rather than being seen as a complete human being. "So when I see talent like yours being wasted," Leonard said, his voice suddenly softer, more intimate, "it makes me sad. It makes me think about all the opportunities that are being squandered, all the potential that's being thrown away, because someone decided to play it safe to settle for less than they could be." Mrs. Wellington nodded along from her nearby table, caught up in Leonard's rhetoric. Several other diners were leaning forward, hanging on his every word. He had transformed the conversation from Deborah's moment of triumph into a philosophical discussion about success and failure, with her as the primary example of wasted potential. "But maybe," Leonard said, his eyes gleaming with sudden inspiration, "maybe tonight is the night that changes. Maybe tonight is the night you decide to stop hiding your light under a bushel." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, the latest model that probably cost more than Deborah made in 2 months. "You see this," he said, holding up the device. "This little machine connects me to 12 million followers. 12 million people who trust my judgment, who value my opinion, who look to me for inspiration and guidance." Deborah felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand where this was heading. "What if," Leonard said, his voice building with excitement, "what if I were to share your story? What if I were to tell the world about the talented pianist who's been hiding in plain sight serving tables when she should be gracing concert halls?" He began typing on his phone with theatrical flourishes, narrating as he composed his social media post. "Tonight I discovered something amazing," he said aloud as he typed. "Hidden in the most unlikely place, I found a true artist. But here's the question that breaks my heart. Why is she serving tables instead of serving her gift to the world?" Several people at nearby tables had pulled out their own phones, apparently inspired by Leonard's example. The restaurant was transforming into a social media event, with Deborah as the unwilling star. "Sir, please," Deborah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't consent to this." Leonard looked up from his phone with an expression of exaggerated surprise. "Consent? My dear, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Do you know how many people would kill for the kind of exposure I'm offering you? I'm asking you not to post anything about me." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Leonard's fingers paused over his phone screen, and for a moment, the restaurant held its breath again. This was the crucial moment. Would he respect her wishes, or would he demonstrate just how little her consent mattered to him? Leonard's smile grew wider. "You know what I think the problem is, Deborah," he said, putting his phone away with deliberate care. "I think you're afraid. I think you've gotten so comfortable in your little bubble of mediocrity that the thought of actually reaching for greatness terrifies you." The accusation hit like a slap. Around the restaurant, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Leonard's companions looked uncertain now, sensing that their leader had crossed some invisible line. "I think," Leonard continued, his voice growing harder, "that you're exactly where you deserve to be. That all this talent, all this supposed potential is meaningless if you don't have the courage to do anything with it." Francois, who had been hovering nearby with growing concern, finally stepped forward. "Monsieur Grayson, perhaps we should—" "Should what?" Leonard whirled on the maitre d' with sudden fury. "Should pretend that mediocrity is something to be celebrated. Should coddle people who refuse to live up to their potential." The transformation was shocking. In the space of a few minutes, Leonard had gone from charming socialite to something approaching a bully, his mask slipping to reveal the entitled cruelty beneath. "You want to know what I really think?" Leonard said, turning back to Deborah. "I think you're a fraud. I think you put on a nice little performance, played a pretty song, and now you want everyone to pat you on the head and tell you how special you are. But real talent, real artistry, requires more than just playing the notes correctly." His words were designed to wound, to strip away the confidence she had gained from her performance, and reduce her back to the invisible servant he had expected her to be. "Real artistry requires risk," Leonard continued. "It requires putting yourself out there, facing judgment, accepting that some people might not appreciate what you have to offer. It requires the kind of courage that, frankly, I don't think you have." The restaurant was completely silent, now the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Deborah stood frozen, feeling the weight of every eye upon her, feeling the careful walls she had built around herself crumbling under Leonard's assault. But then something unexpected happened. From a table near the window, an elderly gentleman in a rumpled suit stood up slowly, his movements careful but determined. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the silence. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing." Leonard turned toward the interruption with visible irritation. "And you are?" "Professor Emeritus at Duke University, Music Department." The old man's voice was steady, unintimidated by Leonard's wealth or presence. "Retired now, but I spent 40 years teaching piano performance." Leonard's expression shifted slightly, suddenly less certain of his ground. "And in all those years," the professor continued, "I've heard thousands of students play, talented ones, mediocre ones, and everything in between. What I heard from this young lady tonight was exceptional. Not good, not talented exceptional. He looked directly at Deborah, his eyes warm with genuine appreciation. That was a professional-level performance, my dear. The technique was flawless, but more importantly, the musicality was extraordinary. You have a rare gift. Leonard's face flushed red. With all due respect, Professor Gift or no gift, the question remains, why is she serving tables instead of using this supposed talent? The professor smiled, and there was something almost pitying in his expression as he looked at Leonard. Young man, you speak as if success in music is simply a matter of talent and willpower. As if the world were a meritocracy, where cream always rises to the top. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. I've watched brilliant musicians struggle for years to get noticed. I've seen lesser talents succeed because they had connections, family money, or simply got lucky. The music world isn't a fair place, and it's certainly not as simple as your social media philosophy might suggest. Leonard's jaw tightened. Are you saying that talent doesn't matter? I'm saying that talent is necessary but not sufficient. And I'm saying that judging someone's worth based on their current circumstances shows a profound ignorance of how the world actually works. The professor's words hung in the air like a rebuke, and for the first time since his arrival, Leonard looked genuinely uncomfortable. Several diners were nodding in agreement with the professor, and the social dynamic in the room was shifting again. But Leonard wasn't finished. If anything, the professor's intervention had only made him more determined to reassert his dominance. Well, he said, pulling out his phone again. Let's test this theory, shall we? Let's see what the real world thinks of our talented waitress. He began typing rapidly, his fingers flying over the screen. I'm going live right now. 12 million followers, Professor. 12 million people who will get to judge for themselves whether talent matters. Deborah felt panic rising in her chest. Please don't. Ladies and gentlemen of La Fontaine, Leonard announced to the restaurant, his voice booming with artificial enthusiasm. You're about to become part of internet history. We're going live to discuss the fascinating question of talent versus circumstance. Several diners pulled out their phones, apparently eager to capture whatever was about to unfold. The restaurant was transforming into a stage with Leonard as the director, and Deborah as his unwilling star. Good evening, everyone, Leonard said into his phone, which was now broadcasting live to his massive following. I'm here at the exclusive La Fontaine restaurant in Raleigh, where I've just witnessed something absolutely fascinating. He turned the phone toward Deborah, who instinctively stepped back. This is Deborah, and she's a waitress. But she's also apparently a pianist of some skill. Now here's what I want to know from all of you. The live stream counter was climbing rapidly. Hundreds, then thousands of viewers tuning in to watch whatever drama Leonard was orchestrating. Comments began flooding the screen, a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and the cruel excitement that always accompanied potential public humiliation. The question is, Leonard continued, if someone truly has exceptional talent, shouldn't they be using it? Shouldn't they be pursuing their dreams instead of settling for a life of service? The comment stream exploded with responses, most of them supportive of Leonard's position. His followers were used to his philosophy of success through determination, and they were eager to see it validated once again. You know what? Leonard said, his eyes gleaming with sudden inspiration. Let's make this interactive. Deborah, why don't you tell my followers, our followers, why you're not pursuing music professionally? The phone camera was pointed directly at her, now broadcasting her face to thousands of strangers around the world. Deborah felt like a deer caught in headlights, frozen by the sudden exposure. It's complicated, she managed to say. Complicated how? Leonard pressed, sensing weakness. Come on, don't be shy. These people want to understand. Help them understand why talent like yours goes to waste. The cruelty of the moment was breathtaking. Leonard had weaponized his platform, turning his massive following into a jury that would judge Deborah's life choices without knowing anything about her circumstances, her struggles, or her story. But then the professor spoke again, his voice cutting through Leonard's performance like a blade. "Son," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "you're being a bully." The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be ignored. The restaurant fell silent, except for the soft ping of comments still flowing on Leonard's live stream. "Excuse me." Leonard's voice was dangerously quiet. "You heard me." The professor stood a little straighter, meeting Leonard's gaze without flinching. "You're using your platform, your wealth, and your influence to humiliate a young woman who has done nothing but serve you dinner and share her gift when you demanded it. That's the behavior of a bully, not a leader." Leonard's face went from red to purple. "How dare you? How dare I tell the truth?" The professor's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the kindness. "How dare I point out that what you're doing is cruel and unnecessary? You asked her to play. She played beautifully, and instead of simply appreciating her talent, you've turned it into a weapon to attack her choices." The live stream comments were shifting now as viewers began to realize what they were witnessing. Some were still supporting Leonard, but others were beginning to express discomfort with the direction of the broadcast. "I'm trying to help her," Leonard said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "No," the professor replied firmly. "You're trying to prove a point at her expense. There's a difference." Leonard stared at the professor for a long moment, his phone still broadcasting their confrontation to thousands of viewers. The social media mogul who had built his reputation on confident pronouncements about success and failure was suddenly facing a challenge he couldn't simply dismiss or overwhelm. But Leonard Grayson hadn't built his empire by backing down from fights. If anything, the professor's intervention had only raised the stakes, turning this from a simple humiliation into a public debate about his entire philosophy. "You know what, Professor?" Leonard said, his voice growing stronger again. "Let's make this really interesting. You clearly believe in this young lady's talent, so let's put it to the test." He turned back to his phone, addressing his growing audience directly. "Here's what we're going to do, everyone. We're going to have a little competition. Our talented waitress here is going to play again, and you're going to vote. Is this the kind of performance that deserves a professional career, or is it just good enough for restaurant background music?" Deborah felt the room spinning around her. This had escalated far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first approached Leonard's table. What had started as a simple request for her wine order had become a public trial of her worth as both an artist and a human being. And here's the really interesting part. Leonard continued, his entrepreneurial instincts taking over completely. "If the majority of viewers think she's truly exceptional, I'll personally fund her first professional recording. But if they agree with me that talent without ambition is worthless, then maybe our professor friend here will admit that the real world isn't as kind to dreamers as academia might suggest." The restaurant erupted in murmurs as people realized what Leonard was proposing. He was essentially crowdsourcing Deborah's future, turning her dreams into content for his social media empire. "Sir, I never agreed to this," Deborah said, finding her voice despite the chaos swirling around her. "Life doesn't ask for your agreement, sweetheart," Leonard replied, not even looking at her as he continued to address his phone camera. "Opportunities come when they come, and you either seize them or you don't." But the professor wasn't finished either. "This is unconscionable," he said, his academic composure finally cracking. "You can't gamble with someone's life like this. You can't turn human dignity into entertainment." Leonard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Human dignity. Professor, I'm offering her the chance of a lifetime. I'm willing to invest real money in her talent if she can prove it's worth investing in. How is that not dignified?" "Because you're treating her like a trained seal performing for fish," the professor shot back. "Because you're using your platform to coerce her into participating in your little social experiment." The live stream was now approaching 20,000 viewers, drawn by the drama unfolding in real time. Comments were flying by too fast to read, a mixture of excitement, outrage, and speculation about what would happen next. Deborah looked around the restaurant, seeing faces that ranged from fascinated to horrified. These people had come for dinner, and found themselves witnesses to something that felt almost gladiatorial in its cruelty. Some were clearly enjoying the spectacle, others looked deeply uncomfortable, but none seemed willing to intervene decisively. Francois the maitre d' was wringing his hands near the entrance, clearly torn between his desire to maintain order and his fear of alienating his most influential customer. Mrs. Wellington was whispering urgently to her companions, apparently debating whether to stay or leave. The whole carefully orchestrated world of La Fontaine was coming apart at the seams. And in the middle of it all stood Deborah, a woman who had simply tried to do her job and had somehow found herself at the center of a viral storm that was completely beyond her control. The piano sat in the corner, like a silent witness to the chaos, its black surface reflecting the restaurant's lights like a dark mirror. Just minutes ago, it had been her sanctuary, the place where she could speak her truth without words. Now it had become the instrument of her potential salvation or destruction, depending on the whims of thousands of strangers on the internet. Leonard was still talking to his phone, still performing for his audience, but Deborah had stopped listening to his words. Instead, she found herself thinking about her mother, about the sacrifices that had been made, about the dreams that had been deferred, but never abandoned. She thought about the countless hours she had spent practicing in secret, the music that lived in her heart despite all the forces that had tried to silence it. And slowly, quietly, a different kind of strength began to build inside her. Not the desperate courage of someone with nothing to lose, but the deeper resolve of someone who finally understood what they were fighting for. Leonard's live stream had become a monster with a life of its own, fed by the collective hunger of viewers who demanded to see how this drama would unfold. But what Leonard didn't realize was that in creating this spectacle, he had also created something else entirely, a moment when Deborah Carter would finally have to decide who she really was and what she was willing to fight for. The restaurant held its breath as she began to walk not toward the exit, as many expected, but toward the piano. The black and white keys beckoned to her like old friends, promising not escape, but the chance to speak her truth one more time louder and clearer than ever before. As Deborah's fingers touched the keys for the second time that evening, something fundamental had shifted. The first performance had been about proving herself worthy of basic respect. This one would be about reclaiming her voice from those who saw. As Deborah's fingers touched the keys. For the second time that evening, something fundamental had shifted. The first performance had been about proving herself worthy of basic respect. This one would be about reclaiming her voice from those who sought to exploit it. Leonard's live stream counter had climbed past 30,000 viewers, each one waiting to cast judgment on her life through the cold lens of their phone screens. "Wait," she said quietly, her hands poised above the keyboard, but not yet playing. The word carried clearly in the expectant silence, stopping Leonard mid-sentence as he continued his commentary for his growing audience. "What did you say?" Leonard's voice carried a note of surprise. He had expected compliant submission to his manufactured drama. Deborah turned on this piano bench to face him directly, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. "I said wait. Before I play another note, I want to tell them something. I want to tell your followers the truth." Leonard's expression shifted, uncertainty flickering across his features for the first time all evening. This wasn't part of his script. The truth about what? About why I'm here. About why someone with my training is serving tables instead of performing at Lincoln Center. Deborah's voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was feeding her courage rather than draining it. The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to have stopped, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Leonard's phone continued to broadcast the viewer count still climbing, but now the energy in the room had shifted completely. "You see," Deborah continued, looking directly into the camera, "Mr. Grayson here has built his entire philosophy on the idea that success is simply a matter of talent plus determination. That if you're truly exceptional, the world will recognize it and reward you accordingly. Leonard's face was growing pale as he realized that his carefully orchestrated humiliation was slipping out of his control. But what he doesn't know, Deborah said, her voice carrying a weight of experience that commanded attention, is that I graduated summa cum laude from Juilliard. I was the youngest student ever accepted into their doctoral program. I spent 6 years studying under some of the most renowned pianists in the world. The restaurant erupted in shocked murmurs. Leonard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The live stream comments exploded with surprise and confusion as viewers tried to process this revelation. I had a full scholarship to study in Vienna with the Vienna Philharmonic. I had recording contracts on the table. I had everything that Mr. Grayson seems to think automatically comes with talent and hard work. Deborah's eyes never left the camera, speaking directly to the thousands of people watching. But then my mother got sick. The weight of those words settled over the restaurant like a heavy blanket. Mrs. Wellington's hand went to her throat, and several other diners leaned forward, completely captivated by this unexpected turn. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Deborah continued, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind the words. The doctors gave her 6 months. The treatment costs were astronomical, and even with insurance we were looking at hundreds of thousands in medical bills. Leonard tried to interrupt, but surely there were other options. Were there? Deborah's voice cut through his protest like a blade. Tell me, Mr. Grayson, when was the last time you had to choose between pursuing your dreams and keeping someone you love alive? When was the last time you had to calculate whether a concert career could generate enough income fast enough to pay for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover? The live stream had gone completely silent in terms of Leonard's commentary. He stood frozen, his phone still broadcasting, but his usual confidence completely shattered. I turned down Vienna, Deborah said, her voice gaining power. I turned down the recording contracts. I moved back home and took care of my mother for 2 years. 2 years of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and watching the strongest woman I'd ever known slowly fade away. Tears were visible on several faces throughout the restaurant now. The professor who had defended her earlier was nodding slowly, his own eyes bright with emotion. And when she died, Deborah continued, I was left with $250,000 in medical debt, student loans for my education at Juilliard, and a music industry that had moved on without me. Leonard finally found his voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. But you could have... There must have been ways to... Ways to what? Start over. Do you know what happens to classical musicians who disappear from the circuit for 2 years? Do you know how quickly you're replaced? How fast the industry forgets you existed? Deborah stood up from the piano bench, facing Leonard directly now. I applied for over 300 positions. Orchestra seats, teaching positions, accompanist jobs. You know what I was told over and over again? That I'd been out of the game too long. That my resume had gaps. That they needed someone with more recent experience. The restaurant was completely silent, except for the soft sound of someone crying. Leonard's face had gone from pale to ashen as the implications of her story sank in. So I came to Raleigh, Deborah said, because it was where I could afford to live. I took this job because it was what was available. And yes, I serve tables, but I also send money to my younger brother so he can finish college without the debt that I carried. I pay for piano lessons for 3 kids in my neighborhood whose families can't afford them. And every morning before my shift I come in early and I play that piano because music isn't something you abandon just because the world doesn't make space for it. Leonard's live stream was chaos now. Comments were flying by faster than anyone could read, a mixture of outrage at Leonard's support for Deborah and shock at the revelation. The viewer count had climbed past 50,000 as word spread across social media about the drama unfolding in real time. But here's the thing that someone like you will never understand, Deborah said, stepping closer to Leonard, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, but still carrying clearly through the restaurant. My worth as a human being was never dependent on whether I made it to Carnegie Hall. My mother didn't love me less because I chose her over my career. The children I teach don't receive any less joy from music because I'm not famous. And the music I make doesn't become less beautiful just because it doesn't earn me millions of dollars." Leonard's hand holding the phone was trembling now. The comments on his live stream had turned completely against him, with viewer after viewer expressing disgust at his treatment of Deborah. "You want to know why I serve tables?" Deborah asked, her voice building to a crescendo. "Because service is not something to be ashamed of. Because taking care of people, whether it's bringing them dinner or teaching their children, or sacrificing your dreams so someone you love can live a few more months, is not a failure. It's what makes us human." The applause started slowly, with the professor rising to his feet and clapping steadily. But it quickly spread throughout the restaurant until every person was standing applauding, not just her words, but the courage it had taken to speak them. Leonard looked around the restaurant in shock, seeing faces that had been deferential to his wealth just minutes ago, now looking at him with something approaching disgust. His live stream comments were a waterfall of criticism, his carefully cultivated image crumbling in real time. But the evening's revelations were far from over. "There's something else," said a voice from the back of the restaurant. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed, rising from a corner table where she had been dining quietly throughout the entire confrontation. Something that Mr. Grayson might find particularly interesting. Leonard's face showed a flicker of hope, as if this might be a lifeline thrown to save his drowning reputation. "And you are Catherine Morrison," the woman said, walking slowly toward the front of the restaurant. "I'm a talent scout for Sony Classical." The restaurant gasped collectively. Even Deborah's composure wavered for a moment as she recognized the name. Catherine Morrison was a legend in the classical music world, responsible for discovering some of the most successful recording artists of the past 2 decades. "I've been sitting here all evening," Catherine continued, "listening to this fascinating discussion about talent and success. And I have to say, Mr. Grayson, your understanding of how the music industry actually works is remarkably naive." Leonard's face flushed red again. "I beg your pardon? You seem to believe that talent automatically translates to opportunity." Catherine said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making those opportunities happen. "But what you've just witnessed tonight is exactly why our industry is broken." She gestured toward Deborah, who was still standing by the piano, looking stunned by this latest development. "I know who Deborah Carter is," Catherine said, and the restaurant fell silent again. "I've known for 3 years. Her professors at Juilliard still talk about her. Her senior recital is used as an example for current students. When she disappeared from the circuit, people in our industry noticed." Deborah's eyes widened. You knew." "Of course I knew. And I know why you disappeared too. The music world is small, Deborah. Word gets around when someone sacrifices their career for family." Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "What I didn't know was where you had ended up." Leonard was frantically trying to regain control of the situation. "Well then, this is perfect. If she's as talented as everyone seems to think, then surely—" "Surely what?" Catherine's voice cut through his bluster like ice. "Surely she should be grateful for your little social media stunt. Surely she should thank you for turning her personal story into content for your followers." The live stream viewer count had climbed past 70,000 now, but the comments had shifted entirely. What had started as Leonard's attempt to showcase his philosophy about success and failure had become a public relations disaster of epic proportions. "The truth is," Catherine continued, "I've been trying to find Deborah for 6 months. We've been developing a new series of recordings focused on underrepresented stories in classical music. Stories of musicians who've overcome real obstacles, real challenges, real sacrifice." Deborah's hand went to her throat. 6 months. "I had investigators looking for you. Private detectives, industry contacts, social media monitoring. But you'd disappeared so completely, changed your name back to your maiden name after your mother's illness moved across the country. It was like you'd vanished." Leonard's live stream was now complete chaos. His followers were abandoning the stream in droves, many leaving scathing comments about his behavior. The carefully constructed empire of influence he had built was crumbling in real time. "But tonight," Catherine said with a slight smile, "tonight you've made my job much easier. Because now the whole world is going to know Deborah Carter's story." She turned to address Leonard's phone camera directly. "Mr. Grayson, you wanted to talk about talent and success? Let me tell you about real success. Real success is someone who gives up everything for love and still finds a way to keep their gift alive. Real success is someone who serves others without losing their sense of self-worth. Real success is someone who faces financial ruin and personal loss and still has the grace to teach children piano for free." Leonard tried one last desperate gambit. "But I was going to help her. I offered to fund her recording." Catherine's laugh was sharp and cold. "With what money, Mr. Grayson?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Leonard's face went completely white. "Oh yes," Catherine continued. "I know about your little financial troubles too. Did you think the music industry doesn't talk to the business world? Did you think we don't know about the leveraged buyouts gone wrong? The real estate deals that collapsed, the desperate attempts to maintain a lifestyle you can no longer afford?" The restaurant was dead silent now. Even the live stream comments seemed to have paused as viewers processed this latest revelation. "The truth is," Catherine said, her voice relentless, "Mr. Leonard Grayson is nearly bankrupt. Has been for 6 months. All those expensive dinners, those charitable donations, that lavish lifestyle he broadcasts to his followers, it's all funded by credit and investor money that's about to run out." Leonard's phone clattered to the floor as his hands began to shake uncontrollably. The live stream continued broadcasting from the floor, showing nothing but the restaurant's ornate ceiling. But the audio was still picking up every devastating word. "So when you offered to fund Deborah's recording," Catherine continued, "exactly what money were you planning to use? The money you don't have, the credit lines that are already maxed out, or were you just planning to crowdfund it from your followers, turning even your supposed generosity into another content opportunity?" Leonard's carefully constructed world was imploding completely. The man who had built his reputation on success and confidence was revealed as a fraud, someone living a borrowed life, funded by borrowed money, while lecturing others about ambition and achievement. But Catherine wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice growing softer, but somehow more dangerous. "Something that makes tonight even more interesting." She pulled out her own phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a document. "You see, Mr. Grayson, when I was researching Deborah's background, I came across some interesting information about this restaurant." Francois, the maitre d', suddenly looked nervous. "What kind of information?" "Well, it turns out that La Fontaine has been struggling financially for quite some time. The pandemic hit upscale dining particularly hard, and this place has been hemorrhaging money for 2 years." The restaurant staff exchanged worried glances. This was clearly news to them. "But what's really interesting," Catherine continued, "is that someone has been making regular, substantial payments to keep La Fontaine afloat. Anonymous payments routed through several shell companies to hide the source." Deborah looked confused. "I don't understand. What does that have to do with anything?" Catherine smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a genuinely warm expression. "Those payments, Deborah, have been coming from a trust fund. A trust fund established by your mother before she died." The words hit Deborah like a physical blow. She staggered backward, gripping the piano for support. "That's impossible. She didn't have any money. The medical bills." "Your mother was a lot smarter than you knew," Catherine said gently. "She sold her life insurance policy to an investment company, took the payout while she was still alive, and used it to establish a trust. Not for you directly, but to ensure that wherever you ended up working, you'd have job security." Deborah's knees gave out, and she sank onto the piano bench, tears streaming down her face. The restaurant was completely silent, except for the sound of her quiet sobs. "She's been taking care of you this whole time." Catherine continued, her own voice thick with emotion. making sure you had a stable income, a safe place to work while you figured out how to rebuild your life. Leonard's live stream was still broadcasting from the floor, capturing the raw emotion of the moment. But now, instead of cruel entertainment, it had become something else entirely. A testament to love's sacrifice and the complicated nature of success and failure. "And here's the beautiful irony," Catherine said, looking down at Leonard's phone on the floor. "Mr. Grayson has been dining regularly at a restaurant that was kept alive by the love of a woman who never met him, subsidizing his meals with money earned through sacrifice he couldn't comprehend." Leonard was completely broken now, sitting in his chair like a deflated balloon. His empire of influence was crumbling, his financial house of cards was exposed, and his philosophy of success had been revealed as the hollow posturing of someone who had never faced real adversity. "So tell me, Mr. Grayson," Catherine said, her voice carrying the full weight of judgment. "Now that you know the real story, what do you think about talent and success? What do you think about the people who serve you? What do you think about the sacrifices that are made every day by people you've never bothered to see as fully human?" Leonard couldn't speak. The man who had built his career on having opinions about everything, on judging others with supreme confidence, was finally facing the reality of his own limitations. Francois quietly picked up Leonard's phone from the floor, ending the live stream that had climbed to over 100,000 viewers before cutting out. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences that had come before, not expectant or tense, but peaceful, like the calm after a storm. Deborah was still crying, but they were tears of relief rather than humiliation. The weight of secrets and shame that she had been carrying for 3 years was finally lifting, replaced by the strange comfort of being truly known and understood. "There's one more thing," Catherine said, approaching Deborah gently. "The recording contract I mentioned, it's real. We want to tell your story, Deborah, but we want to tell it right. Not as some inspiration porn about overcoming obstacles, but as a genuine exploration of what it means to be an artist in a world that doesn't always make space for art." Deborah looked up through her tears. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of exposure." "You don't have to decide tonight," Catherine said kindly. "But think about it. Think about all the other talented people out there who are struggling, who have had to make impossible choices, who think they're alone in their sacrifice. Your story could help them understand that their worth isn't measured by traditional success." The professor who had defended Deborah earlier approached slowly, his face shining with something that looked like vindication. "You know," he said quietly, "this is exactly what I try to teach my students. That art isn't about fame or money or even recognition. It's about truth. And tonight we've heard more truth than this room has probably ever contained." Leonard finally stood up slowly, his face pale and his hands still shaking. Without his phone, without his audience, without his carefully constructed persona, he looked smaller, somehow diminished. The expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that the man wearing it had been revealed as fundamentally empty. "I should go," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Catherine said simply. "You should." As Leonard gathered his humiliated entourage and made his way toward the exit, the restaurant began to breathe again. Conversations resumed quietly, but the entire atmosphere had been transformed. The careful hierarchies that had defined the evening, wealth over service, fame over substance, appearance over reality, had been completely upended. Deborah remained at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, but not playing. The instrument that had been both her sanctuary and her trial was now simply what it had always been, a way to speak the truth when words weren't enough. "Would you play something else?" asked a young woman from a nearby table. "Something for yourself this time, not for anyone else." Deborah looked around the restaurant, seeing faces that were no longer judging or evaluating, but simply listening, simply present. For the first time in 3 years, she felt truly free to make music without ulterior motive or hidden agenda. Her fingers found the keys, and the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the air. The melody was gentle, contemplative healing, not a performance for validation or a demonstration of skill, but simply music for its own sake, shared with people who had learned to listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. As the last notes faded into silence, Deborah knew that whatever came next, recording contracts or continued waitressing recognition or anonymity, she would face it as herself completely and without apology. The evening that had begun with cruel humiliation had ended with something approaching grace. And in the quiet that followed, she could almost hear her mother's voice, proud and loving, reminding her that some victories can only be won by refusing to fight on someone else's terms. The final notes of Clair de Lune hung in the air like a benediction, but the evening's transformations were far from complete. As Deborah lifted her hands from the keys, she noticed that Catherine Morrison was typing rapidly on her phone, her expression intense with purpose. The classical music scout's fingers moved with the urgency of someone who had just witnessed history in the making. "What are you doing?" Deborah asked softly, still feeling emotionally raw from the revelations about her mother's secret care. Catherine looked up with eyes that sparkled with excitement. "I'm calling in every favor I have, reaching out to contacts who need to hear about tonight. But first..." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "There's something else you need to know about your mother's trust fund." The restaurant, which had just begun to settle into a peaceful quiet, suddenly tensed again. Deborah felt her stomach clench with a familiar dread. "What do you mean?" "The payments to keep La Fontaine afloat weren't the only provisions your mother made," Catherine said, scrolling through documents on her phone. "She was far more strategic than any of us realized." Francois, who had been quietly supervising the cleanup of Leonard's dramatic exit, moved closer with obvious concern. "I'm sorry, but what exactly are you suggesting about the financial arrangements of this establishment?" Catherine's smile was enigmatic. "Your mother, Deborah, didn't just ensure you had job security. She ensured you had a platform." The words hung in the air like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Around the restaurant, conversations had died down as diners sensed another revelation approaching. "I don't understand," Deborah said, though something cold was beginning to form in her stomach. "La Fontaine isn't just any restaurant." Catherine continued, her voice gaining momentum. "It's been a known gathering place for music industry professionals for over a decade. Record executives, talent scouts, classical music critics, they all dine here regularly. Your mother researched this place extensively before she set up the trust." Mrs. Wellington, who had been sitting quietly at her table, suddenly spoke up. "My late husband was on the board of the North Carolina Symphony. We've been coming here for 15 years precisely because so many music people frequent this establishment." Deborah's eyes widened as the implications began to sink in. "Are you saying your mother engineered this?" Catherine said gently. "She didn't just keep you employed, she positioned you in the exact place where you were most likely to be discovered by people who could recognize your talent. Tonight wasn't an accident, Deborah. It was 3 years in the making." The revelation hit the restaurant like a thunderclap. Francois nearly dropped the wine glass he was holding, and several diners gasped audibly. The professor who had defended Deborah earlier began to smile with what looked like admiration. "That's impossible," Deborah whispered. She was sick dying. She couldn't have planned something so elaborate. Catherine's expression grew tender. "Your mother spent her final months doing research instead of resting. Hospital nurses told me she had boxes of music industry publications, restaurant reviews, financial records. She was mapping out your future, even as she was fighting for her life." Tears were streaming down Deborah's face again, but now they carried a different emotion. Awe mixed with grief, love mixed with overwhelming gratitude. "But there's more," Catherine continued, and the restaurant held its breath once again. "The trust fund doesn't just cover La Fontaine's operating expenses. It includes provisions for what your mother called opportunity enhancement." "What does that mean?" Francois asked, his French accent thick with confusion. Catherine turned to address the entire restaurant. "It means that every music industry professional who has dined here in the past 3 years has had their meals subtly subsidized. The trust has been covering 20% of every check for anyone connected to classical music making. This the most affordable fine dining experience in the city for exactly the people who might discover Deborah. The restaurant erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Wellington's hand went to her throat as she realized the implications. You mean every time I've brought visiting conductors or music critics here? Your mother was essentially paying for them to have the opportunity to hear you play, Catherine confirmed. She turned this entire restaurant into an elaborate audition space, with you as the unknowing centerpiece. Deborah sank back onto the piano bench, overwhelmed by the scope of her mother's love and planning. 3 years, she whispered. For 3 years, she's been orchestrating this moment. Actually, said a new voice from the entrance, it's been longer than that. Everyone turned to see a man in his 60s entering the restaurant, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was impeccably dressed, but carried himself with the confident ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. And you are? Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. James Morrison, the man said with a slight smile. Catherine's husband, and until recently the managing partner of Morrison Hartwell and Associates, one of the largest estate planning firms in the Southeast. Catherine's face went pale. James, what are you doing here? Following up on the case that has consumed our firm for the past 4 years. James replied, his eyes finding Deborah across the restaurant. The case of Sarah Carter's estate and the most complex trust structure we've ever implemented. Deborah felt the room spinning around her. My mother came to you 5 years ago, James confirmed, walking slowly toward the piano. Long before her diagnosis, she had saved every penny from her job as a music teacher, had researched investment strategies, had even taken out additional life insurance policies. She was planning for your future, with the kind of precision usually reserved for Fortune 500 succession planning. The restaurant was completely silent now, every ear straining to catch James's words. Your mother predicted that you would sacrifice your career for her care. James continued, his voice gentle but clear. She knew you well enough to know that you would choose love over ambition every time, and she wanted to make sure that choice didn't destroy your future. But how could she have known I'd end up here specifically? Deborah asked, her voice barely audible. James smiled. Because she didn't leave it to chance. The trust has been subtly influencing your life for years, that apartment you live in. The rent is 20% below market rate because the trust covers the difference. The piano you practice on at home, purchased and maintained by the trust through a shell company. Even the job application you submitted to LaFontaine, the manager who hired you, received an anonymous recommendation about your character and work ethic. Francoise's eyes widened. The letter, there was an unsigned letter that came with her application. We thought it was from a previous employer. Your mother wrote it, James confirmed. She had researched every member of your staff, every regular customer, every business practice of this restaurant. She wanted to ensure you would land somewhere safe, somewhere where your talent would eventually be recognized. Deborah was crying openly now, the magnitude of her mother's love and sacrifice finally becoming clear. She gave up everything twice, she whispered. Once for me, and then again for me. Not gave up, Catherine said softly. Invested. She invested in your future with the same passion you invested in her care. But James wasn't finished with his revelations. There's one more provision of the trust that activates tonight, he said, pulling out a thick envelope from his jacket. Your mother wrote specific instructions for what should happen when you were finally discovered by someone in the music industry. He handed the envelope to Deborah with ceremonial care. She wanted you to read this in front of witnesses, people who could understand the magnitude of what she accomplished. Deborah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in her mother's familiar handwriting along with several legal documents. As she began to read aloud, her voice was thick with emotion. My dearest Deborah, she began, then paused to compose herself. If you are reading this, then my plan has worked. You have been discovered, and you are finally ready to reclaim the career you sacrificed for me." The restaurant was so quiet that the ticking of the antique clock seemed thunderous. "I know you chose me over your dreams, and I know you have never regretted that choice. But I could not bear the thought of your talent being lost forever because of my illness. So I have spent our final months together creating a path back to the life you deserve." Deborah's voice broke, and Catherine moved to stand beside her, offering silent support. "The trust contains enough money to cover your living expenses for 5 years while you rebuild your career. It also includes funds for recording demos, hiring an agent, and covering the costs of auditions and performances. But most importantly, it gives you the freedom to choose music again, not out of desperation or financial need, but out of love." The legal documents in Deborah's hands were shaking as she continued reading. "I have also arranged for letters of recommendation to be sent to 15 major orchestras, conservatories, and recording labels. These letters will be delivered exactly 1 week from the date you read this. They contain testimonials from your former professors at Juilliard, recordings of your senior recital, and detailed documentation of your technical achievements." Catherine gasped. She orchestrated a comeback campaign. But here's the most important part. Deborah continued, her voice growing stronger. "I am not doing this because I think your worth depends on fame or success. I am doing this because I know that music is not just what you do, it is who you are. And the world deserves to hear the voice I was privileged to nurture." James nodded with professional admiration. "Your mother understood something that most people never grasp. True legacy isn't about what you accomplish in your own lifetime. It's about creating opportunities for others to flourish after you're gone." The professor who had defended Deborah earlier stood up slowly, his face shining with emotion. "This is the most beautiful example of parental love I've ever witnessed," he said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "Your mother didn't just save your career, she transformed an entire ecosystem to support your success." But Catherine was studying the legal documents with growing excitement. "James, these provisions, they're extraordinary. The trust doesn't just support Deborah, it creates a perpetual scholarship fund for other musicians facing family crises." "That's correct," James confirmed. "Every year, the Sarah Carter Foundation will provide financial support for 3 classical musicians who have had to interrupt their careers due to family emergencies. Your mother wanted to ensure that other talented people wouldn't face the same impossible choice you did." Deborah's tears had given way to something approaching awe. "She turned her tragedy into hope for others." "She turned your sacrifice into systemic change," Catherine corrected. "This foundation will help musicians for decades to come." Mrs. Wellington rose from her table, her composure finally cracking. "I need to say something," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the restaurant. "I have been coming to this establishment for 15 years, and I have always prided myself on recognizing talent when I see it. But tonight I realize how blind I have been." She walked slowly toward Deborah, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor. "I have watched you serve me dozens of times, and I never once saw you as anything more than the help. I never bothered to learn your name, never considered that you might have dreams or talents or a story worth knowing." The restaurant was completely silent as Mrs. Wellington continued her confession. "Your mother saw something in human nature that I have been too privileged to understand, that society will overlook extraordinary people if they're in ordinary circumstances. So she created extraordinary circumstances to ensure you would be seen." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I am going to use my influence differently from now on. I'm calling the artistic director of the North Carolina Symphony right now tonight to tell him about what I've witnessed." As Mrs. Wellington began dialing, her transformation from imperious socialite to passionate advocate was complete. The woman who had dismissed Deborah with barely a glance was now becoming her champion. Francois, meanwhile, was pacing behind the bar with growing agitation. "This changes everything about how I understand this restaurant," he said, his French accent thick with emotion. "For 3 years I have been participating in an elaborate act of love without even knowing it. He stopped pacing and faced Deborah directly. "Mademoiselle, your mother has made me an unwitting guardian of your dreams. This restaurant, these tables you have served, they have all been part of her plan to ensure your talent would be discovered." Catherine was still studying the trust documents, her excitement building. "Deborah, there's something else here. Your mother arranged for recording studio time at Abbey Road. 6 months of studio access with the London Symphony Orchestra available for accompaniment." The restaurant erupted in gasps and exclamations. Abbey Road was legendary, the most prestigious recording facility in the world. The opportunity to record there with the London Symphony was something most classical musicians could only dream of. "When?" Deborah asked, still trying to process the magnitude of her mother's planning. "The booking begins 3 months from today," Catherine replied. "Just enough time for you to prepare a full concert repertoire and assemble the support team you'll need." James nodded with satisfaction. "Your mother timed everything perfectly. The trust provisions, the recording opportunity, even tonight's revelation, it's all part of a carefully orchestrated timeline designed to maximize your chances of success." But suddenly, the restaurant's atmosphere shifted again as the front door opened with unusual force. A woman in her 30s burst in, her hair disheveled and her eyes wild with panic. "Francois," she called out desperately. "Francois, please, I need to speak with someone." The maitre d' hurried toward the distressed woman. "Mademoiselle, we are closed for a private event." "My name is Jennifer Liu." The woman interrupted, her voice shaking. "I'm an investigative journalist with the Charlotte Observer, and I've been tracking a story about Leonard Grayson's financial crimes for 6 months. The restaurant fell silent as everyone processed this new intrusion. "I followed his live stream tonight." Jennifer continued, pulling out a recording device. "And I need to warn everyone here that what happened tonight isn't over. Leonard Grayson is dangerous, and now that his public image has been destroyed, he's going to be desperate." Catherine stepped forward, her expression suddenly alert. "What kind of dangerous?" Jennifer's hands were shaking as she spoke. "He's been using his social media platform to manipulate stock prices, running elaborate Ponzi schemes through his real estate ventures, and there's evidence he's been blackmailing public figures to maintain his lifestyle." The implications hit the room like a wave. Leonard's humiliation tonight hadn't just damaged his reputation. It had potentially exposed criminal activity that he would be desperate to cover up. "But there's worse," Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "My sources tell me he's already putting together a campaign to discredit everyone who was here tonight. He's hiring private investigators, social media manipulation firms, and legal teams to destroy the credibility of anyone who witnessed his breakdown." Deborah felt ice forming in her stomach. "He's coming after us." "He's coming after all of you," Jennifer confirmed. "And he has the resources to make your lives very difficult, at least until the criminal charges catch up with him." The mood in the restaurant shifted dramatically. What had been a celebration of love and discovery was suddenly clouded by the threat of retaliation from a powerful man with nothing left to lose. But Catherine's expression was fierce rather than frightened. "Let him try," she said, her voice carrying the steel of someone who had survived decades in the cutthroat music industry. "Leonard Grayson doesn't understand what he's unleashed tonight." She turned to address the entire restaurant. "This story is bigger than his little revenge fantasies. By tomorrow morning, every major media outlet in the country is going to know about Sarah Carter's incredible legacy and Deborah's remarkable talent. Leonard can hire all the private investigators he wants. He can't stop a story this powerful from spreading." James nodded with grim satisfaction. "And he certainly can't intimidate a trust structure designed by one of the best estate planning firms in the Southeast. Sarah Carter's provisions include legal protections specifically designed to shield Deborah from exactly this kind of retaliation." But Jennifer wasn't finished with her warnings. "There's something else. Leonard's live stream tonight was recorded by dozens of viewers. Some of those recordings are already going viral, but others are being bought up by Leonard's team to prevent them from spreading." She pulled up her phone to show a social media monitoring app. "He's spending hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to control the narrative. buying trending topics, hiring bot networks to flood social media with disinformation about tonight's events. The restaurant buzzed with concerned murmurs as people realized that the battle for truth was just beginning. But here's what he doesn't know. Jennifer continued with a slight smile. I've been recording everything tonight with professional equipment. Hidden cameras, high-quality audio, multiple angles. Leonard Grayson's destruction has been documented by a journalist, not just random diners with phones. Catherine's eyes lit up with understanding. You can ensure the real story gets told. More than that, Jennifer replied. I can ensure that Leonard's criminal activity gets exposed at the same time. My investigation into his financial crimes was already nearly complete tonight, just gave me the final pieces of evidence I needed. The revelation that tonight's events had been professionally documented shifted the power dynamic completely. Leonard might have influence and money, but he was about to face the focused attention of serious journalism. How long do we have before he strikes back? Francois asked, his practical concerns showing. Jennifer checked her phone. Based on his pattern of behavior, probably 48 hours. That's how long it usually takes him to organize a full-scale reputation destruction campaign. Catherine was already making plans. Then we have 48 hours to get ahead of his story. Deborah, I'm calling every contact I have in classical music arts journalism and cultural broadcasting. By the time Leonard launches his attack, your story will already be established in the public consciousness. James was nodding approvingly. The trust includes provisions for exactly this scenario. Sarah anticipated that success might bring unwanted attention and retaliation. There are legal and financial resources available to protect Deborah from harassment campaigns. Mrs. Wellington, who had finished her call to the symphony director, approached with determination written across her features. I'm mobilizing my social network as well. Every cultural institution, every music patron, every arts board member I know will hear about tonight's events from authoritative sources before Leonard's disinformation campaign can take hold. The professor stood up again, his academic bearing now mixed with activist energy. And I'm reaching out to every music educator in the region. This story needs to be told in conservatories and music schools. Young musicians need to hear about both Sarah Carter's incredible love and the systemic problems that make such elaborate planning necessary. As the restaurant filled with the energy of people mobilizing for a cause, Deborah found herself at the center of something much larger than her personal story. Her mother's love had created ripple effects that were transforming not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who had witnessed the truth being revealed. The piano sat silent in the corner, but its presence felt different now, not just an instrument for personal expression, but a symbol of the power of art to reveal truth and create change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, potential attacks from a desperate man with diminishing power, and the complex work of rebuilding a career that had been interrupted by love and sacrifice. But tonight, surrounded by people who had been transformed from strangers into allies, Deborah finally understood what her mother had really given her. Not just financial security or career opportunities, but something far more precious. The knowledge that she was loved beyond measure, that her talent mattered to the world, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from individual achievement, but from the collective power of people who choose to see and celebrate the extraordinary within the ordinary. The battle for her future was just beginning, but for the first time in 3 years, Deborah felt ready to fight, not alone, but surrounded by an army of people who believed in her story and were willing to help her tell it to the world. The energy in La Fontaine had transformed from elegant dining to war room planning, when Catherine's phone began buzzing with an intensity that made everyone freeze. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "What is it?" Deborah asked, sensing the shift in Catherine's demeanor. "It's my assistant at Sony Classical." Catherine said, her voice tight with concern. "Leonard's people have been calling our offices for the past hour, claiming that tonight's events were staged, that you're part of some elaborate fraud scheme." Jennifer Liu stepped forward, her journalistic instincts sharp. "That's impossible. He can't have organized a response that quickly. Catherine shook her head grimly. Apparently he can. My assistant says they have lawyers threatening libel suits, private investigators demanding access to our artist files, and social media specialists spreading rumors that you're not really a Juilliard graduate. The restaurant fell silent as the implication sank in. Leonard wasn't waiting 48 hours to strike back. He was already launching his counterattack. But there's more. Catherine continued reading from her phone. They're claiming that the trust fund story is fabricated, that James here is an actor hired to create a fake emotional narrative. James's face flushed with indignation. That's absurd. I have decades of legal documentation, client testimonials, professional credentials. They don't care about truth. Jennifer interrupted her experience with powerful men's desperate tactics showing. They care about creating enough doubt to muddy the waters. By the time the real evidence comes out, the story will be old news. Mrs. Wellington, who had been quietly making calls from her table, suddenly stood with an expression of barely controlled fury. I just spoke with 3 arts organizations, and they've all received similar calls. Leonard's people are systematically contacting everyone in the cultural community, poisoning the well before our version of events can spread. The mood in the restaurant shifted from triumph to siege mentality. Francois began pacing again, his hands gesturing wildly as he processed the threat to his establishment. This cannot happen, he said, his French accent thick with emotion. This restaurant has been part of Mademoiselle Deborah's mother's beautiful plan for 3 years. I will not allow it to be destroyed by that man's lies. But as if summoned by their fears, the restaurant's front door burst open again, this time admitting a young man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase and wearing the predatory smile of someone delivering bad news. "Excuse me?" He called out, his voice cutting across the restaurant like a blade. "I'm looking for Deborah Carter, Catherine Morrison, and James Morrison. I have legal documents that require immediate attention." Jennifer's investigative instincts kicked in immediately. "Who sent you? What law firm?" The young man's smile grew wider as he reached into his briefcase. "Blackstone Mitchell & Associates. We represent Mr. Leonard Grayson in matters of defamation, conspiracy, and fraud." He began pulling out thick legal documents, spreading them across the nearest table like weapons being displayed. "Miss Carter, you are being served with a cease and desist order regarding your false claims about attending Juilliard. Mrs. Morrison, you are being notified of pending litigation for your libelous statements about our client's financial status." The restaurant erupted in shocked murmurs, but the lawyer wasn't finished. "And Mr. Morrison," he continued, turning to James with particular relish, "you are being charged with conspiracy to commit fraud in the fabrication of estate documents designed to support this elaborate hoax." James stepped forward, his decades of legal experience evident in his calm demeanor. "Young man, I'd be very careful about the accusations you're making. False charges of fraud carry serious professional consequences." The lawyer's confidence never wavered. "We have evidence that the entire trust fund story is fabricated. Bank records document, analysis, witness testimony. Everything needed to prove that tonight's events were a carefully orchestrated deception designed to damage our client's reputation." Catherine's face was pale, but determined. "That's impossible. The trust documents are real. The payments to this restaurant are documented. The provisions Sarah Carter made are legally binding." "Are they?" the lawyer interrupted, pulling out a tablet and showing them a screen filled with financial data. "Because according to our investigation, Sarah Carter died with approximately $12,000 in assets. There was no life insurance payout, no secret savings, no elaborate trust fund." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Deborah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as everything she had just learned about her mother's love and planning seemed to crumble. "That's not possible," she whispered, but doubt was already creeping into her voice. The lawyer continued his assault with professional ruthlessness. "Furthermore, our investigation reveals that Mr. Morrison's law firm never had Sarah Carter as a client. The documents he presented tonight are forgeries professionally created, but legally worthless. James's face had gone from calm to thunderous. "This is preposterous. I have client files, signed documents, recorded meetings." "Do you?" the lawyer challenged, tapping his tablet again. "Because our digital forensics team has already determined that the metadata on your supposed client files shows they were created last week, not 4 years ago." The revelation sent shockwaves through the restaurant. If the documents were fake, if the trust fund was fabricated, then everything they had just celebrated was built on lies. But Catherine was studying the lawyer with the sharp attention of someone who had spent decades evaluating people's credibility. "There's something wrong here," she said slowly. "Your timeline doesn't make sense. If Leonard only learned about Deborah tonight, how did his team have time to conduct a full financial investigation, create fraudulent counter-evidence, and prepare legal documents?" The lawyer's confident smile flickered for just a moment, a tiny crack in his professional facade that Jennifer Liu caught immediately. "That's an excellent question," Jennifer said, stepping closer to the lawyer with her recording device openly visible. "How exactly did you manage to investigate 4 years of financial records in less than 2 hours?" The lawyer's recovery was smooth, but not quite quick enough. "Our client has been aware of this brewing scandal for several days. We've been preparing for tonight's revelation." But his answer only raised more questions. Francois, despite his distress, was sharp enough to spot the logical flaw. "But monsieur, how could your client know about tonight when none of us knew what would happen? The confrontation, the piano performance, the revelations about the trust. How could anyone have predicted these events?" The lawyer's briefcase suddenly seemed less like a weapon and more like a prop in a performance that was beginning to unravel. Jennifer was now circling the lawyer like a predator who had caught the scent of a wounded prey. "Let me ask you directly, did Leonard Grayson know about Deborah Carter before tonight?" "I'm not authorized to discuss the details of our client's knowledge or investigation methods," the lawyer replied, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Catherine's eyes suddenly widened with understanding. "Oh my God, he's been planning this too." The restaurant fell silent as everyone processed the implication. If Leonard had known about Deborah in advance, if he had come to La Fontaine specifically to confront her, then his entire performance tonight had been as calculated as Sarah Carter's 3-year plan. "But that means—" Deborah's voice trailed off as the horrifying possibility took shape. James, his legal mind working rapidly through the implications, suddenly looked grim. "It means Leonard Grayson has been investigating the trust fund for some time. It means he may have been specifically targeting Deborah for reasons we don't understand." Mrs. Wellington, who had been listening with growing alarm, suddenly gasped. "The phone calls, the arts organization said they received calls about Deborah specifically, not just generic warnings about fraud. They already had detailed information about her background." The lawyer was now looking distinctly uncomfortable as his story continued to fall apart under scrutiny. "There's something else," Jennifer said, checking her phone with growing excitement. "I just received a message from my editor. They've been fact-checking Leonard Grayson's claims, and guess what they found?" She held up her phone, showing a news alert. "Sarah Carter's bank records show exactly what James said they would. Multiple life insurance policies, carefully managed investments, and a trust fund managed by Morrison Hartwell and Associates for the past 4 years." The lawyer's face went completely white. That's impossible. Our investigation clearly showed—" "Your investigation showed fabricated evidence." Catherine interrupted, her voice building with righteous anger. "You've been presenting forged financial documents to support false claims about fraud." The tables had turned completely. The lawyer who had arrived to destroy their story with accusations of fraud was now revealed as the actual perpetrator of document falsification. Francois, his protective instincts fully engaged, stepped toward the lawyer with barely controlled fury. "You came into my restaurant, disrupted my guests, and tried to destroy the reputation of a young woman with fabricated evidence." But the lawyer was already backing toward the door, his confident demeanor completely shattered. I was acting on information provided by my client. If there were errors in our research, Errors, James's voice carried the full weight of his legal authority. You just accused me of professional fraud based on documents you knew were fabricated. That's not an error, that's criminal behavior. Jennifer was typing rapidly on her phone, her journalistic instincts in full overdrive. This is even better than I hoped. Not only do we have Leonard's public breakdown on livestream, we now have documented evidence of him using forged documents to retaliate against his victims. The lawyer realized that his mission had not only failed, but had actually strengthened the case against his client. He was gathering his fabricated documents with desperate haste when Catherine delivered the final blow. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of discovery that made everyone freeze. "I just realized something. If Leonard has been investigating Deborah for weeks, if he knew about the trust fund, and came to LaFontaine specifically to confront her, then this wasn't random cruelty. This was targeted harassment." The implications hit the room like a revelation. Leonard hadn't stumbled into tonight's confrontation, he had orchestrated it as deliberately as Sarah Carter had orchestrated Deborah's discovery. "But why?" Deborah asked, her voice small and confused. "Why would he target me specifically? I never did anything to him." Jennifer was already pursuing the answer, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke rapidly with someone on the other end. After a tense moment, she hung up and turned to face the room with an expression of grim satisfaction. "I know why," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a major revelation. "My sources at the Financial Crimes Unit just confirmed something they've been investigating for months. Leonard Grayson has been specifically targeting individuals with legitimate trust funds, trying to discredit them publicly so he can swoop in and acquire their assets through legal manipulation." The restaurant erupted in gasps and angry exclamations. The scope of Leonard's predatory behavior was even worse than they had imagined. "He's been running a sophisticated con game," Jennifer continued. "Find people with real inheritances or trust funds, publicly destroy their credibility with fraud accusations, then offer to help them by taking control of their assets to protect them from further attacks." Catherine's face was white with horror. "How many people has he done this to?" "At least 17 that we know of," Jennifer replied. "All young artists or musicians, all with legitimate inheritances, all publicly humiliated and then financially manipulated." Deborah felt sick as she realized how close she had come to falling into Leonard's trap. So tonight was supposed to be the public destruction phase, Jennifer confirmed. He would humiliate you on livestream, then his lawyer here would swoop in with fraud accusations, and within a few days, Leonard would emerge as the concerned citizen, offering to help you sort out the confusion about your trust fund. James was shaking his head in professional disgust. "It's an elaborate form of financial predation, targeting vulnerable people in emotional situations." The lawyer, realizing that his client's entire scheme had been exposed, made a desperate break for the door. But Francois, his protective instincts fully aroused, stepped directly into his path. "Non, monsieur," the maitre d' said firmly. "You are not leaving until the police arrive." Mrs. Wellington was already dialing. "I'm calling Detective Morrison, no relation," she said with a slight smile toward James. "He specializes in white-collar crime and has been very responsive to our arts community's concerns." The lawyer's attempts to leave became increasingly frantic as he realized he was trapped in a room full of witnesses to his attempted fraud. "You can't hold me here, I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Jennifer said with grim humor. "And I'd suggest you exercise it because everything you've said tonight has been recorded by a professional journalist." But the evening's revelations weren't over yet. Catherine's phone buzzed again, and this time her expression shifted from anger to amazement. "It's the artistic director of the London Symphony Orchestra," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "He's calling about Deborah." Everyone fell silent as Catherine answered the call, putting it on speaker so the room could hear. "Catherine, darling, I hope I'm not calling too late," came a crisp British accent through the phone. "But I just watched the most extraordinary live stream and I had to reach out immediately." Catherine's eyes met Deborah's across the restaurant. "Hello, Marcus. You saw Leonard Grayson's broadcast. I did indeed, and it was absolutely fascinating. Not because of that dreadful man's behavior, but because of the young pianist who performed Chopin with such remarkable artistry. I understand her name is Deborah Carter. Deborah's hand went to her throat as she realized that Leonard's attempt to humiliate her had instead broadcast her talent to one of the most influential figures in classical music. Marcus, Catherine said carefully, what exactly did you see? I saw a performance of extraordinary sensitivity and technical brilliance delivered under what can only be described as hostile conditions. The musicality, the interpretation, the sheer courage of performing while being psychologically attacked, it was remarkable. The restaurant was completely silent, except for Marcus's voice coming through the speaker. But here's what really caught my attention. Marcus continued. I've heard that name before. Deborah Carter. Wasn't she the Juilliard prodigy who disappeared several years ago? The one all the conservatory professors still talk about. Catherine's smile was growing wider by the second. Yes, Marcus. That's exactly who she is. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I've been hoping she would resurface. We have an opening for a featured soloist in our upcoming American tour, and based on what I saw tonight, she would be perfect. Deborah sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the speed with which her life was transforming. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from invisible waitress to potential international soloist. But Marcus, Catherine said, there's something you should know about the circumstances of her disappearance and what brought her to tonight's performance. As Catherine quickly summarized the evening's revelations about Sarah Carter's trust fund and Leonard's predatory scheme, Marcus's responses grew increasingly supportive and indignant. What an extraordinary story of maternal love and artistic dedication, he said when Catherine finished. And what a perfect example of why our industry needs to do better at supporting artists through personal crises. He paused for a moment before continuing with characteristic British understatement. I say, would Miss Carter be interested in recording an album with us? Something that tells her story while showcasing her remarkable talent. Deborah looked around the restaurant, seeing faces that had been transformed from strangers to champions over the course of a single evening. The professor who had defended her was beaming with pride. Mrs. Wellington was wiping away tears of joy. Francois was practically glowing with satisfaction. Even the lawyer, still trapped and waiting for police, looked grudgingly impressed by the turn of events. Marcus, Deborah said, finding her voice despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, I would be honored. Marvelous. I'll have our people call Sony Classical tomorrow to begin arrangements. And Miss Carter, tonight's performance, even under those dreadful conditions, was truly special. Your mother would be very proud. As the call ended, the restaurant erupted in applause and celebration. The transformation was complete. Leonard's attempt to destroy Deborah had instead launched her toward international recognition. Jennifer was typing frantically on her laptop, crafting the story that would expose Leonard's predatory scheme while celebrating Sarah Carter's incredible legacy of love. This is going to be front-page news, she said with satisfaction. But more importantly, it's going to help other artists understand that they're not alone when they face impossible choices between career and family. James was already making plans for the legal implications. The trust fund provisions include resources for pursuing criminal charges against people who try to manipulate or defraud the beneficiaries. Leonard Grayson picked the wrong target. Mrs. Wellington stood up, her transformation from dismissive socialite to passionate advocate now complete. I'm organizing a benefit concert, she announced. All proceeds will go to the Sarah Carter Foundation to help other musicians facing family crises. The police arrived just as the celebrations were reaching their peak, and the lawyer was quietly arrested for attempted fraud and conspiracy. As he was led away, he turned back toward Deborah with an expression that mixed defeat with grudging respect. Your mother, he said quietly, was a remarkable woman. It was the first genuine statement he had made all evening. As the police paperwork was completed and the restaurant began to empty, Deborah found herself alone with the piano once more. The instrument that had been her sanctuary, her trial, and her salvation, sat waiting in the corner, its keys reflecting the soft light of the chandeliers. She walked over and sat down, her fingers finding the keys with the easy familiarity of a conversation with an old friend. This time, she played something she had never performed for anyone else. A piece she had written during her mother's final weeks, a musical letter that captured all the love and gratitude and grief that words could never express. As the melody filled the quiet restaurant, she could feel her mother's presence, and every note could sense the approval and joy that transcended death itself. The piece built to a triumphant climax that seemed to celebrate not just survival, but transformation. The alchemy that turns sacrifice into strength, love into legacy, pain into purpose. When the final notes faded into silence, Deborah knew that her journey was just beginning. There would be recordings to make, concerts to perform, stories to tell. There would be other Leonard Graysons to face, other challenges to overcome, other moments when she would have to choose between safety and truth. But she would face them all with the knowledge that she was never truly alone, that her mother's love had created a network of support that would sustain her through whatever came next. The waitress who had served tables in invisible silence had been transformed into an artist with a voice that could change the world. And in the quiet that followed her private performance, she could almost hear her mother's voice one last time, proud and loving and infinitely wise. Some victories can only be won by refusing to fight on someone else's terms. Play your truth, baby girl. The world is ready to listen. The restaurant was empty now, except for Deborah and the piano, but the silence felt full, rather than lonely, pregnant with possibility, rich with hope, alive with the promise of music yet to be made and stories yet to be told. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight had proven that love properly invested could overcome any obstacle and transform any ending into a beginning. As she finally rose from the piano bench and prepared to leave La Fontaine for what might be the last time as an employee, Deborah carried with her not just the promise of a new career, but the deeper knowledge that her mother's greatest gift had not been financial security or professional opportunity, but the understanding that true success lies not in what you achieve for yourself, but in what you make possible for others. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning.